Good afternoon and welcome to the third and final talk on Arlington Main Street, past and present. The first two kind of covered how Main Street has changed over the years. The buildings have changed and what they look like now compared to what they look like starting around, say, 1860 and through 1890s and the present. The second one was kind of an industrial Arlington review. The third one, today's talk, basically covers mills. And I decided to enlarge it so it includes Sandgate, Sunderland, and Arlington mills, because they're quite remarkable when you really look at the detail there and the extent to which the number of mills were built and productive in this area. I'm Bill Budde, the curator for the Russell Collection at the Martha Canfield Library, and I do some other things on the side, but this is what I mainly do, is a lot of the local history material and questions. So if you have questions, feel free to ask as we go along or at the end. To get started, the early mills were amazing. And they really developed based on financial, and they wanted to stimulate settlement in this area. All new towns had to have something to draw people to settle in the towns. Things that drew people to the area were based on, this area had abundant natural resources, which is the trees, the forests. They were huge. They had a lot of minerals in these mountains as well, but that was not what we became known for. And they also had a lot of water power. Industries developed basically to attract the tourists. When they settled the towns, Governor Benning Wentworth issued charters. And there were a group of people, investors, called proprietors, that bought into the charters. Most of them never intended to settle here, but they intended to take their share and sell it. And one of the attractive things was the natural resources in a town. Better the resources, the more they could sell their, more likely it is, they could sell their property for profit. The idea is you attract settlers and you want to make sure that the resources are income producing to have people feel they can come here and make a living of some kind. So the way that took place was you needed water power and you needed transportation and access to markets. And they had that in this area. The water power through the three towns is rather extensive and surprisingly well developed. But the other process that made this look attractive to the investors and to people to move here is the transportation routes. The road, what we now call 7A, is the main north-south route between the south part of the state and the north part of what became the Republic of Vermont. Also, starting right here at the corner of Route 313, going west, was access to the markets in Albany and Troy, which meant that the settlers could harvest or produce products and then go west, sell them at a profit, and bring scarce cash back here and build up the income and the structure of the town to support more settlement. Forests were great. Forests provided the raw material for building. They also provided cash income. And the cash income was year-round. During the winter, after they had cut trees and harvested trees to open up the fields and build basically log cabins. And we have stories about the log cabins that they built in and lived before they built their actual home. They could take the refuse from those trees they cut down and burn them and collect it and then sell those ashes after they boiled them down as an income-producing product in Albany and Troy. And they would go down through Route 313 in the springtime when the road opened up and the weather was better and sell that over in Troy. And they could then buy products that weren't available here very easily. Maybe things like cast iron kettles, clothing, to make clothes with, farm implements, things like that. So there was a real market that developed going both ways. Water power was the next crucial element in that process of making this an attractive settlement area. The mills are interesting. If you look at the evolution of mills, they became increasingly more sophisticated. The earliest ones were hand mills. They were basically two stones or even a rock and another flat rock that people would grind things on. They eventually developed and they became more sophisticated. You go a little bit more, and Pompeii has an excellent example of mills that were operated by east of Burton. They had mules or donkeys or horses that would be hooked up to these mills. There'd be basically a brace that came out of here. They would attach a harness to the horse and it would walk around in circles and feed the grain in through the top to mill it. Much more efficient. Had to progress to the point where they could actually carve the stone and make the pieces fit together fairly concisely so that they would actually produce the product. The next step was to harness water power. That became very sophisticated. The water power developed in several different ways, but the main was the harnessing the power through use of water wheels. Wind-powered mills were not very common in this part of Vermont. We just didn't have the type of terrain that encouraged a lot of wind power. You may find it more accessible up towards Lake Champlain where there are more open spaces up there. But here we find mostly the mill based on waters and streams. Water power was very sophisticated by 1640. There's some excellent early how to build mills and how to build complex basically ironworks in France and England at this time. It reached the point where the Saugus Ironworks north of Boston operated with water power, a 500-pound drop anvil, drop forge. It also was able to operate a slitting mill. After they produced the iron, rolled it through and flattened it out, they then had cutting, slitting mills. They would cut that up into usable pieces that could then be sold, and blacksmiths would turn it into nails and all sorts of things. The Piscataqua River in Maine was actually an offshoot of the Saugus Ironworks, and they had an incredible setup up there with a mill that ran 9 saws, and the saws were basically up and down reciprocating type saws. But the water power was sophisticated enough and captured enough energy to be able to operate 9 saws at one time. I think that's pretty amazing up there. One thing that's important is the types of wheels. Around here, we don't find too many of we don't find any brass shot wheels that I've been able to identify in our 3 towns. But we do find the undershot wheel and the overshot wheels in the different mills around here. And they based on the elevation and the terrain. And they were also easier to build than the breast shot wheels. The number of mills is sometimes surprising when I think about it. The Badkill had 6 or 7 mills. By the 19th century, Peter's Brook was the most developed. And at that point, a lot of the other mills had gone out of existence. Part of the focus on Peter's Brook was that it still had a nice infrastructure. It still had mills, dams in place. And it still had enough of a fall so the water could fall far enough to run the mills. But the other thing that happened was, we'll get to in a little bit, the change in power and technology for generating power in these mills. Mill Brook, off of Fisher's Lane, had 4 mills, and it was kind of surprising. It was one of the earlier mill areas. Peters Brook had at least 4, and then you get into the Roaring Branch, had as many as 14 at one time. The real trick sometimes is to be able to access and identify where these mills were located on the mills, on the stream sites. Enough time has passed, so a lot of the remains are very, very fragile and hard to identify. Arlington's earliest mills included the 1765 Remember Baker Mill in East Arlington. By 1780, the Canfield family on the Batten Hill had a nice mill set up that became very large over the following years. The Buck Mill, that was also, many people still know it as the Red Mill, about almost into New York State on the Batten Hill River. And the Canfield Marble Mill. And it's always surprising for me to understand that there was enough water power here to run a marble mill to saw, harvest the marble, and then saw it in a mill here. So, to get back to the basics, to make this attractive to settlers, the very, very early proprietors had a meeting in 1764 and voted to give 50 acres of land to anyone who would set up a grist and a sawmill in Arlington on basically what became Peters Brook eventually. By the first day of November 1765, and that was quite a challenge to somebody to come in here in this wilderness basically. They would have to cut all the wood, hand hew the frame of the factory, and then put it together. And Remember Baker took that up and built the mill. And he was rewarded with 50 acres of land and free use of the Peters Brook, which was a very big deal. He didn't have to pay any taxes on that. He had free use to rent it out to anybody or use it as he saw fit. But we do have these early records, and Jehail Hawley, one of the founders of the town, supported him and backed him in his efforts to get the mill going. The mill, most people know, is basically, this is Old Mill Road, and this is Peters Brook, and the mill is located just inside the boundary with Sunderland. Very, very excellent place for building a mill because it had enough of an elevation in the fall over the length of the brook so that you'd get enough water power coming down into the mill to run the either sawmill or the grist mill. One of the problems they had is if you don't have that elevation, if the water is just basically level, you can't get enough force coming in through the mill to do a lot of heavy-duty milling. So Peters Brook has that elevation. You see, remember the falls in East Arlington there, behind the old paper mill. It was damaged in 1789. There's a question about whether the whole thing was rebuilt or whether part of it was rebuilt. But it doesn't matter. It's been continuously operating right through the 1920s. It was a working grist mill at that point. Now, Peters Brook is also an excellent site to see how they manage the water from the dam. What they would do is above the dam, or above the mill, they would build a dam that would make a mill pond, and that would build up enough water, level water above the mill itself, so that when it fell down on this mill wheel, it would have enough force to do all sorts of work that was asked for it to do. And I mentioned the Saugus Ironworks. The water falling from the mill dam in Saugus was enough energy to lift up a 500-pound drop hammer. in the forge there, and do that like probably, I think it was 3 times a minute, maybe more. But they had to get the water from the dam, and it came through a sluice or a mill race to the water wheel, and then there was often a tail race that ran off from that. And sometimes what you can see is, you can see where the dam was, you can sometimes see remains of the mill race, and often see the tail race that brought the water back into the main waterway. Peters Brook, until fairly recently, you could see where those remains were. These are photos from probably the 1890, 1900. You can see the dam across Peters Brook, the falls that people describe as being very scenic these days, very photogenic. And then you see the mill race along the side here that took the water to the Remember Baker mill. And this is a good detailed photograph here because you can see that it was basically a manufactured tube, and it was held together with steel bands to make it sturdy and handle the water. You also get an idea of the refuse and the garbage from, that would build up around these sites. If it wasn't cleaned up, then it would become very messy and sometimes affect the operation of the mill. In the Baker mill, the water basically came down that sluiceway into the bottom of the mill through this opening. And there was a water wheel under that powered the mill on the inside. It was a grist mill and sawmill at some point. It's hard to see that now, but you can barely see over here where it faces Peters Brook on the side, on the south side of the building. And it becomes very impressive if you've been here for some of the heavy storms that we have around here. Peters Brook becomes a rather photogenic, impressive level of water through there. Northeast Arlington. We don't think of Northeast Arlington as being that well developed, but along what's now called Fisher Road, the early Canfield family moved in there. And early on, it used to be known as Mill Street. Along the mill, it's called Millbrook, there was a mill constructed by the Canfield family. And also, next to the mill up there, had a tannery. It was very, very early, probably the 1790s, 1780s, when the mill and the tannery were up there. If you were at the last talk, the reputation of tanneries is they stink. They're basically, you put all these animal hides into a big vat of liquid and let it rot for several months, and then you process the hides. They became very smelly. So you wanted to make sure you lived in the upwind section of that. You didn't want to necessarily live downwind of that. And what developed into one of the largest mill sites in Arlington was actually was originally a Canfield mill on the Baton. It later became known as the Lathrop Mill site, the Miles Vaughan or Vaughan Miles mill site before it closed down. But it's outstanding today because you can still see a lot of the vestiges of where the mill was. The thing to note, this is the bridge and the road up to what's now the West Mountain Inn. And over the years, the mill grew. It started off with a small building on the riverside with a mill race. And it was developed very, very quickly, over 50 years probably, but became very important and a major income producer for many of the residents in the area. Associated with that is what we don't think of very much, but there were a couple marble quarries here in town that produced some high-quality marble for gravestones, tombstones, sidewalk building materials. But there was a mill run by the water there that processed and cut the marble, that was harvested from those mills, those quarries. There's some rather well-known early carvers. Probably the best known was the Collins family, but the Eden and Rule families, McKee families were big in terms of producing marble that was sold for commercial use in Troy, Albany, and along eventually the Erie Canal. During the winter, early summer, they would quarry the marble. During the winter, they would process it, decorate gravestones, and then when the spring and the roads opened up, they would then put them in wagons and carry them west, and basically traveling marble salesmen. Get onto the Erie Canal when the canal was finished, and bring those even further west to sell. And there are stories about the Arlington marble being sold probably as far west as at least Rochester. Now, this is the last known photograph of the marble quarry that the Canfield family ran. And actually, when it closed, it wasn't run by the Canfield family. It really points out that there's a whole problem with industrial accidents, and this was one of the early industrial accidents. There were 5 men working on the quarry, and they sent basically the young boy off to get water for them, and while he was gone, apparently somebody had been tamping the powder, and it blew up and killed these 5 men. After that, the family didn't run the mill or that quarry anymore. It just sat there until, I think it was, I read the 50s when it was cleaned up, and a lot of the old equipment that had sat there since 1868 was cleaned out and sold, I think by the Vaughn family. It points out too, the problem of the mills is also industrial accidents. Mills were dangerous places to work. One of the very, very first published industrial accidents reported here in town was Elisha Galusha, who was killed in a sawmill accident in 1783. He was a Revolutionary War veteran, had a family, wife and a child that he left behind. But he was 25 years old when he was killed. I think the other thing it points out too is the research for this is kind of interesting because it was reported in the Vermont Gazette. It was reported in the local newspaper, which was published in Bennington at the time. So they did cover things like this, industrial accidents. It became big news. The mill at the base of West Mountain Inn developed by 1900. The Canfield mill was purchased by Ernest Lathrop, and it became known as the Lathrop Mill. Lathrop was became a big family around here, very influential and very wealthy. Canfields made a lot of their income and money on the mills and the woods and the forests that they harvested, the stores that they ran to sell the goods. The huge, rather large building. You can see it here and here and here. But one of the things that stands out is that you see photographs of the mills. They're pretty run-down, raggedy-looking places. They weren't kept up. They weren't kept up. They weren't painted. They look pretty fragile in some cases. Like you can just, a good wind would blow them over. But all of the money went into selling the goods and cutting the timber, and the margins were very small. So you don't see a lot of, classy buildings like you come to expect these days. You remember Baker Mill never looked this good as it does today. So it's one way to think about that. The buildings up on the hill here, it's some think that may be part of the West Mountain Inn today. What strikes me in looking at the three photographs is there are no trees up here on the ridge line. And then as you come forward, you start to see the trees have grown back. And it's becoming more and more wooded, more and more what we expect to see today. And the estimate that I've always been impressed with is this forest that we have on the mountains today is possibly the 5th regrowth forest. That it's been cut and harvested 4 or 5 times, and this is the fifth experience of that. That's a lot of lumber that was cut, a lot of lumber that was processed. The other thing that was impressive, and I still find it impressive, is the mill pond for the Lathrop Mill and the Canfield Mill. The dam came across the Battenkill River here. But this is where the photographs is really helpful because you can start to see where the timber was floated down the Battenkill through the mill dam and was stored over here before it was processed in the mill. As they needed lumber, they would take it out of the mill dam, put it through the mill, cut it up, and then make finished products of different kinds out of that. It's interesting today, this is where the dam was, and this was what it looked like in 2014, but it pretty much looks the same today. You can still see across the river where there is a kind of a ridge of stone that points out where that dam was. And if you look on each shore, there are more ruins, I guess, of where it was anchored on both sides of the river. So if you know what to look for, you can sometimes see the vestiges of these faded mills. West Arlington, it's interesting, between the Lathrop Mill and West Arlington, there were no other mills along the river. It's kind of telling to think about that. And one of the things that you have to have in order to have a productive mill is enough water flow. You have to have head to get that water powerful enough to run the mill. The next mill was down here just about into New York State, half a mile from New York State, what became known as the Red Mill. That's 1856 when this map was made. They produced brush handles. There was a grist mill and sawmill there that produced other material, wood. Wood was used for so many types of items, but the one that amazes me sometimes is the number of brush handles. You find a lot of these mills had, the main product was brush handles. So you had brush handles for scrub brushes, paint brushes, hair brushes, all sorts of things, utility brushes. And that's all they produced. The problem, like I mentioned, is between the Lathrop Mill and West Arlington is there was not enough drop in the river to get a good head of water if you put a mill in. Also, the banks of the river were pretty flat. There were no banks to hold the water in on the sides. So even if you did put a mill in, it would just get wider and not deeper. So that kind of restricted where they could actually set up these industrial work projects over the years. This mill was one of the earliest mills, one of the 3 earliest mills. Known, I think, first as a buck mill. Battenkill, later on the Battenkill Handle Company, and then the Red or Birch Mill, and its last incarnation. And it was struck by lightning in 1965 and burned. And we were talking about this before with a couple of folks, and it's just amazing the effect it had. All the people that were working in that mill were then unemployed. And it supported a whole community on the west part of Arlington along the Hill River there. They did brush bags, butter paddles, you know, all sorts of woodenware. So it was quite a range of products they made to keep, you know, keep people employed, is what it came down to, and produce income for the community. There's several paintings and photographs of the old mill before it burned, which are kind of, you know, what people recall when they think about the mill. It's painted red, if I remember right. And this is another interesting mill that people don't really remember. We tend to forget about it. It's the Macaulay Mill. The Macaulay was a large, wealthy family here in town. They did a lot of stone work, they did a lot of mill work, and one of the earliest references to the Macaulay family is that the Masonic Lodge met on the 3rd floor of the Macaulay house there. It's a big red house next to the, on the south side of the Roaring Branch. And it's kind of interesting, the old maps actually identify where the mill was. For a long time, I thought the mill was probably next to the house. The house is located on this side of the river, what's now Route 7A. But it's located across the road where the barns and the buildings for the camping on the Battenkill are located now. And if you look along the side there on that southern bank of the Roaring Branch across from the sugar shack, you can start to see some ruins of where the mill race was and where the buildings were. It's kind of impressive to think that there was a big operation there. Again, the mill itself doesn't look like much. Basically, it protected the saw blade and the workings of the mill, and that was it. It was cold during the winter, hot during the summer, but it wasn't there to look pretty. East Arlington sites, there were several sites in East Arlington that are kind of interesting, but the one that strikes me is the Barney Mill site. The Barney Mill site this is Warmbrook Road, and this is Ice Pond Road. And when the mill was put in, there was no Ice Pond Road at that point. The mill was located behind Don Brown's house. People are familiar with where Don Brown lived. But the mill pond was across what's today known as Ice Pond Road. That mill pond also provided water for the McLaughlin machine shop. The McLaughlin machine shop was basically on the East Arlington Road, just before you get to the road where you turn off to Maple, used to be known as Maple, and now it's Sunderland Hill Road. And right there in the corner was where the McLaughlin machine shop was. And it's hard to see today, but there was a little mill pond there, and a mill race. And the mill race is barely visible. But until fairly recently, I think the 1970s, the machine shop building was still there. When Dave Thomas owned the property, it was starting to become pretty dilapidated and unsafe. And they had the volunteer fire company practice their firefighting skills by burning that machine shop down at that point. But if you look carefully, if you walk along the road there, you can still see where that mill race is along there. It's not very easy to find. But the other site, based on that Warm Brook, is what became known as the Hale Company site across the road of. At the time, it was a mill run by Canfield and West, Canfield and West Company. And they had their mill pond there. The water was diverted through their mill run on both sides there. You can still see part of that if you get back in there. We'll come. Something I find more interesting in many ways is the Judson saw frame factory. It was built in 1830 along Peters Brook on the west side of Ice Pond Road, today's Ice Pond Road. It later became known as the Camber Block and the Colonial Theater. This is interesting. This is the fire department where the fire hall is today. This is the very first fire hall. You can see the top where they would hang hoses up to dry in the early days. But what's impressive is the amount of lumber that they stack beside the Judson frame saw factory. It's up almost 3 stories high. It's just amazing to imagine somebody getting up that high without modern equipment to stack lumber to let it dry, that they would then process in the factory there. You also see photographs of the old Hale Company, and they had a huge drying area outside of the Hale Company where they would stack lumber, for probably 6 to 10 months to let it cure over after just being cut, milled, and then it would just take a long time to dry out. But the building eventually burned in 1934. They don't know how it caught fire, but they probably suspect arson. But it had been used as a barber shop, the Colonial Theater, the ice cream parlor, East Arlington ice cream parlor there. And there also used to be an ice cream parlor basically just to the south of where the Canfield house is, the brick house that is now the community house. There used to be an ice cream parlor in there, and you can still see signs for that advertising in 1880s, 1890s. But it burned right to the ground, and again, right next to the fire department. Not a whole lot they could do at that point. It was just totally engulfed when the fire was discovered. Any questions at this point? Yeah. Sandgate was interesting. Sandgate has a couple of brooks and rivers. The Green River is the main water source in Sandgate. But the number of different factories that processed lumber along there. They had the oyster cake factory, clothespin factory, brushback factory, a grist mill, and another sawmill down here towards the border with Arlington. And if you drive back through there, you can, along the Green River, you can start to see how the elevation would allow them to do some building through there and build up a good head of water to process material, a lot of lumber materials. Didn't see any mills listed on the side tributaries. There's Terry's Brook up here, and then you don't see anything on that Terry's Brook area. That's pretty much flat compared to the advantage of this part through the center of Sandgate. Sunderland was another area with a lot of mills, a lot of good sources for water power, especially in the north part, almost into Manchester. I think one of the earliest, if not the earliest mill sites was along the Battenkill area up here, not the Battenkill, the Millbrook area up here. The Millbrook empties into the Battenkill up there. But you find early references about the same time as the, remember Baker Mill in 1765 was built. Those were the two competing mills in Sunderland. But look, 3 clothespin factories along Millbrook. Shoe peg factories, 2 shoe peg factories. And then sawmill here in Millbrook. It was quite the operation. And there's quite the fall in there, and there are many opportunities to build a mill dam to store water to run the mills. People familiar with shoe pegs? Shoe pegs were used to replace stitching on shoes. The advantage of shoe pegs is that when shoes get wet, let's say wet, army boots, for example, and a lot of people marching around in the wet mud, that type of thing, the laces would get wet and rot. But shoe pegs would not rot. Shoe pegs would actually probably swell in the water and the moisture and actually hold together better. So you find the shoe peg factory here, Flint Shoe Peg Factory in Arlington, made 40,000 barrels of shoe pegs. They're tiny, they're like an eighth of an inch. Just amazing. But there's a whole industry around how to develop that mill cutting process. Sutherland Mills on the southern part, we're all familiar with the Roaring Branch and the Kelly Stand, the big mill area, and many of our mines and our experiences. We had the Kelly Stand Mill up here originally, and just by the hotel. Eventually, that was converted into a steam sawmill. We'll talk more about that. But as you go down the Roaring Branch, you find 1 mill, 2 mills, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then finally you get down to Chisel Mill, and there's another 7. And there are probably several more along the river there that we don't have records on the maps of. And unless you actually do a very thorough deed search, it's hard to locate all the sites that were used as mill sites. The most developed mill, water mill, actually along the Roaring Branch, was the Chiselville factory site. And this was the Douglas Manufacturing, Edge Manufacturing tool site. Became noted by a couple of names. It was a large building. I mean, this is the lower building, there was a dam up here, and then a bridge over the Roaring Branch about there. But the water power ran this huge, long building where they powered things to process the iron, sharpen the tools, hone the edges on the tools, as well as the handles. They would make the handles as well. So it's quite a sophisticated operation. And one that's not heard about too much. It's the grout mill. The grout mill was on Petersburg. If you're familiar with the Prouty Hill Road, the grout mill was on that road. And you go in there a little bit, and it was just along the side of Petersburg right there. Initially, it's all water power. The dam was a little bit further downstream, but it had a nice head of water there. And it ran pretty much by water until, I think about the 1890s or so. But they converted that old water mill into a steam-driven mill. And it was destroyed by arson fairly recently, in 1976. And there still remains from the mill along the brook there. If you get permission from the owners, you can probably go back there and actually see some of the remains from the old water wheel, the turbines, and some of the equipment that was used to operate the machinery. And that led to basically the Hale Furniture Company. It was a big operation down there. Started off as a water mill operation by Canfield and West. When Canfield and West didn't repay a loan to the Hale Furniture Company of New York City, the Hale Furniture Company took it over and moved up here to run their operations. It was water power until like 1908 when they started to convert into steam power. But that's fairly recent in my mind. Of course, it's more than 100 years ago now, but steam really picked up around this 1860 time period. You start to see that more and more installed. Now, one of the other things that the smaller mills were all over the place, and this is just east of the, remember, Baker Mill on the line between Sunderland and St. Arlington. Known as the Safford Mill, originally built as a woolen mill by about 1830, so it was a very early mill. By the 1860s, 1880s, they were making pumps and washboards. I didn't bring my washboard today. But there's another mill just upstream from there in Sunderland, the Safford Mill, sawmill. What the woolen mill used, and this is supposedly one of the bobbins from the woolen mill that was used to process the wool. Huge change in industry around Arlington, St. Gate, Sunderland, and the whole state actually. When sheep came in, sheep became very big, and there was a movement to establish a fulling mill here in the border with Arlington and Sunderland. And they would process the wool and wind it on bobbins, these big bobbins like this, to send out to the market. And this actually comes from the Safford Mill, I believe. The other artifact that we were lucky to have is one of these wooden pumps that they made in this mill up here, the Safford Mill. It's to me, amazing. They inserted into a big barrel. The handle would go up and down. There was a leather gasket around this that would draw the fluid up. I think this was probably cider, that type of. It doesn't show any signs of real oil or any other type of material, but it was definitely wet. And they would make these, and they would, remount the inside to get the interior of this, so the pump handle would fit in. And they would mill down the wood for the mill handle, and sell these all over the place, and this spout would come out the side here. The other thing I find amazing is that they would make wooden water pipes, and the process, the machinery that they would have to set up in order to remount the inside of the lumber to get a water pipe that would hold water and transmit the water wherever they went. It's sometimes amazing to think about. I wonder how long they lasted is the big question in my mind. But again, the machinery became much, much more sophisticated and flexible in doing operations like this, from something this small to something large enough for a water pipe. Now, one of the problems with water mills especially, is the idea that they're at the mercy of nature. The big force that really damaged a lot of the mills and required a lot of investment to replace were floods. You also find ice. Some of the rivers would freeze, and then during the spring, when the ice would start to break up, you would get this large whoosh of heavy ice going down the stream and would damage the dams. Sometimes just wash out the dams. And they would have to be rebuilt. Anything along the sides of the dam or the river would also be damaged. There are three stories that come to mind. One is this is what the Safford pump mill site looked like after Irene. And this is just a shadow of what the mill used to be. It used to be much longer and go up further into the Peters Brook. You can imagine that water coming down after a huge flood and washing out part of that mill race, if not the whole mill wheel itself. This is Prouty Hill damage. Again, the Prouty Mill was back in this area along Peters Brook back here, but Irene washed out the road going in there. Incredibly forceful stream of water going through. Washed the whole road away. And I think lowered it about 10 feet. If you have a sense of humor and you're not involved in this, sometimes the images are amazing. This house was for sale at the time, and it said riverfront. And this is the Arlington Rec Park, and you can see the golf course flag. And huge, huge amounts of water, uncontrollable. I want to go back to two stories of this. One story is that we talk about pollution as being a big problem today. One of the early lawsuits that came up was between a mill owner who sued another mill owner above on the river in Sandgate, I believe it was. And the reason the mill owner sued was because his dam was filling up. The dam he built was filling up with the waste and the excess sawdust and wood chips and all sorts of stuff that was running down from the new mill above his mill. And he sued the mill owner, and it went, I think, all the way to the state Supreme Court, and he won his case. And the mill owner above him that had started dumping all the waste into the river was ordered to stop doing that and to clean up, because he affected the income productivity of the mill that had existed beforehand. And it became kind of a nice benchmark law that people have to respect who's downstream. You can't just do things willy-nilly. You have to look at the consequences of that. Yeah, that's probably enough for that right now. I mentioned the sheep. There was a big move early on, 1836, the Arlington Cotton and Wooling Manufacturing Company. Sheep were becoming big. There was a lot of wool in the area, and they saw a possible market if they could process all that wool that was shorn from the sheep. The market died, and the market died because of the tariffs that were imposed, and it became cheaper to buy land in the West, where there was much, much cheaper land and much, much cheaper cost to raising sheep. It was also closer to many of the markets. The country moved west, the markets moved west, and that really affected what we could do here in terms of processing and making a profit on woolen products. So they never really took off, but there's a fulling mill here. I mentioned McLaughlin's machine shop at one point. There was a canal from the Warren Brook that brought water into the machine shop, where it was processed, able to use running machinery by the McLaughlin's. And you can just barely today see an indentation along there. Along there is where the mill race was. And it comes off of the Warren Brook. It goes beside the Warren Brook. You can see where it goes down and feeds the mill. Again, what's striking is the tree line along here. Before 1850, 8 Arlington chair bakers. The first chair baker factory was built in 1830. It's amazing the number of chairs that were built here, 1850 to 60. I mentioned the Canfield West factory went out when it was, they're not able to pay their loan to the Hale Company. Yeah, washboards, cradles, and chairs. Hale Company went on to be a major supplier of chairs, bosun's chairs for the Navy during World War II. Big contract and big market for them. Now, about 1850, the railroad arrives. And the railroad was the big factor that really decimated the mills in the area. With the arrival of basically the train, markets were much more accessible. You could bring your product to this depot in downtown Arlington, and it would be shipped north, south, east, and west, much, much cheaper than it was possible previously. The other change is that steam power with the steam locomotive was utilized to power factories. So you find factories that used to be dependent on streams, brooks, and rivers being able to locate anywhere at that point. So you start to find mill factories being located at sites along the railroad tracks. And this is one of the early ones. This is the Flint Manufacturing, Pig Manufacturing Company. And the buildings are still there. They've changed over the years, but I mentioned how ramshackle some of these buildings looked. Up until 2009, we still had the chimney from the Flint Shoe Cake Factory. It was still a big landmark in town. And that was taken down for insurance reasons. Barney Brush and Handle Shoe Clothespin Factory, Sawmill. They built 15,000 chairs, employing 35 workers. So the numbers are amazing when you start thinking about this. When the mill burned in 1882, business was converted to steam power, and it left that site on Warm Brook. So it freed them up to be near the railroad tracks, so it cut down on their transportation costs. They didn't have to hire people to load things on wagons and then take them over to the railroad. They could be close to the access of raw materials as well as transportation to markets. The dam still remains. I mean, the dam is still there on Ice Pond Road and Warm Brook. Until a few years ago, they still had the ice house. When the Barney mill moved after it burned down, they started harvesting ice. So the mill pond was kept. It would freeze every year, and they would cut ice and then store it into the ice house. The nice thing about ice house is that the insulation was provided by sawdust from the sawmills in town. So that would keep the ice pretty much available for most of the summer season. Again, very ingenious. Skyline changes. As the steam mills come in, you start to see the skyline changing. Before, we had many steam mills, steam engines. You don't see these tall structures. And then a few years later, you start to see chimneys coming up. And they start to stand up above everything else in town. They're the most notable feature as you look out over the village. And then, again, this is fanciful. It doesn't quite fit the terrain here, but the first depot was located here. This goes down beside what's this map molding over here today. The new depot is now located over here, but this is where One Terrace and Woodchuck Hill is located. And what they used to do is store lumber up here to dry. They had these large stacks of lumber on the hillside. Arlington Car Manufacturing Company was the company failed in 1876. They made water pumps, sashes, blinds, anything they could to make use of that building. It was originally built to make railroad cars. They wanted to basically compete with the Pullman Car Company. The cars were so expensive that they made 4 cars and tried to sell them, and they didn't sell any of them. And the Arlington Car Manufacturing Company went out of business. So they converted into making sashes for window frames, blinds, doors, all sorts of wooden products at that point. Any questions? Or I think one of the things that sticks in my mind is how extensive the industry was. And we train ourselves, we can still see some of the remains of that. Yes? Yes?
You mentioned Canfield a few times, Canfield Mill. Is there any relation to like Canfield or Saratoga? Is that family
Not that I'm aware of. The question was, are the Canfields in Arlington related to the Canfields in Saratoga? And I'm not aware of a relationship.
Yes, I had a question. You said at the beginning you were trying to get people to move here and get 50 acres and build a mill and all that. But you also mentioned, other than lumber, minerals. So I'm curious, what were people mining for here? Was it quartz or ore?
No, what they were mining was basically limestone.
Limestone, okay.
And there are several, along with the marble industry, there are several veins of limestone, and they would harvest that and burn it in limestone kilns. And that was a very, very valuable product to sell in Albany, Troy, and down even to New York City.
Because of high heat, it gets really hot.
Well, they had a lot of timber to get the heat to process the lime. So, yeah, they had things to burn. It's just amazing the way they took advantage of that. So. Yes?
What year were the fisheries really affected in that
Wood.
With sawdust and everything from the mills, everything, the fisheries really?
Probably rather early on. And the reason is the mill, especially the Canfield mill, did a lot of milling of timber. So that waste would all go into the river, and that would then be carried downstream, and it would affect the quality of the water for the fish population. And you can see that go up and down over the years, depending upon how clean the water was and when they cleaned up. When they removed certain mill dams, the water quality would get better, but it would take like 5 to 10 years in some cases for that to actually have an impact.
Was that in the 1800s?
Well, the mills were built 1830s, and when was the Canfield Vaughan Dam? It was probably in the 1920s or 1930s when the Canfield Vaughan Dam may have been taken down or washed out at some point. Yes?
You talked about the water wheels powering your early mills and then the transition to steam. Any evidence of water turbines like down in Hancock Village up here?
Not that I'm aware of. There is, I haven't seen it, but the Grout Mill on the Prouty Hill Road has some remains that people have mentioned look like water wheels, turbines that would be powered by the water. A lot of that was, I'm not sure, but I would guess a lot of that was removed as scrap, and there was more of a profit to be sold, in the open market and reprocessed. Some of the mill material features, for example, the wheels, the grinding wheels, were reused as ornaments at the end of somebody's driveway. But the one from the Lawrence Mill, the Remember Baker Mill, was donated to the Weston Mill. And it's, I understand, installed in the Weston Mill there. Is there another question? Yes.
I was wondering about the brush factory in West Arlington. You said there was only one dam, and that the dam was, by the West Mountain, was that there, power?
No, the West Mountain Dam was just east of the West Mountain driveway.
Sure.
The Red Mill Dam was basically a half mile from New York State.
Okay, so there was a dam where the fact,
Right.
yeah. I live there next to this. Curious.
We were talking about that. There's several people that remember the Red Mill
Yeah.
and it burning
Wow.
when it was struck by lightning. We were talking about the painting that was made as the mill burned. That used to be in the I'm just blanking out on the name of the hotel there. Maple Leaf. Yeah. Yes.
Phil, you mentioned that the forests have been cut down, grew back, cut down. Did they try to plant trees? Or was that, did they think that would lumber would last forever?
I'm not sure when they started to do that. I know Dorothy Canfield Fisher back in the 19-teens to 20s planted the trees above her house on Fisher Road. It was kind of interesting because they were just planted right next together. It was very, very dense. And not too many years ago, it was all harvested by a descendant of Dorothy Canfield Fisher's. It was just kind of strip cut. Everything was cut down instead of managed. But that was all. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much, and stay tuned for more talks in the spring, late winter and spring. Thank you for coming.